Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Goldster Inside Story. And for those of you who just saw a little sign welcoming you to Friday Inside Story, that's really funny. That it's actually Thursday. Please don't worry, you have not lost a day. It's great to see you all here, and I'm thrilled today to welcome Katherine May, who is the author of this absolutely gorgeous book, Wintering. It is a book that reads like a long poem. I think it's absolutely beautiful. I read it a while ago and I've been rereading it, but there's lots that I want to talk to Katherine about. Thank you so much for joining us today, Katherine. Welcome to Goldster.
Well, thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here.
So the book that I held up, Wintering, The Power of Rest and Retreat in Difficult Times. Could you tell us about this book, why you first thought about writing it?
Well, in lots of ways, it kind of sprang into my mind all in one go, to be honest. I was talking to a friend one night who was having a hard time. She just felt like everything had gone wrong for her at once, her job and her family life, and she was grieving. And there was this sense for her that everything had gone wrong forever, that she didn't feel like she'd ever recover from this, that she'd reached a kind of end point, a kind of point of terminal decline almost. And I found myself, first of all, recognizing the place that she was in and feeling really strongly that I knew the shape of it, and that it was clear to me from the outside what she was going through, even if to her it felt like something much more catastrophic. And I said, you're wintering at the moment. That's all this is. You're in this period. You're at the bottom of a curve. And as soon as I said it, I thought, oh, that joins together a lot of things I'd been thinking about for a long time. And she's a writer too, and so I went home and I started making notes, and I had to email the next day to say, that thing I was talking about last night, would you be offended if I wrote about it? And that's how it began, really. I've always been a lover of the winter season, and I've always kind of wanted to share that with other people. But I really wanted to be able to talk about these down times in life, these fallow periods that are so hidden from view, but which are common to all of us.
So tell us the word or the phrase kind of wintering, that the idea of winter not just being a season, but being a part of our lives. Could you describe to everybody who hasn't read it, what is wintering?
So wintering is a time in life, what I call a season in the cold. It's a fallow period when something goes wrong. It might be a mental or a physical illness. It might be a big life event like a divorce or losing your job. It might just be a change happening that is perhaps unwanted, and the process of that change can throw us into disarray. And what I wanted to do was draw a kind of lineage between those times when we often feel like we're frozen out from the rest of life, and that everything's carrying on very happily, and everyone seems to be doing just fine except for us, and we feel very isolated. We feel kind of blocked from being able to take any action, and it is, I describe it as kind of falling through the floorboards, really, and looking out at the world that seems to be carrying on without us, but we're somewhere else.
So when your story begins when your husband became ill, would you like to tell everybody how it begins and where that led you to in your own life?
Yeah, so it was actually the eve of my 40th birthday, and we'd gone to the beach with some friends for a day out. And in fact, I just handed in the notice on my academic job at that point. So I was already on the cusp of this big change that I wasn't sure what it was going to bring. I hoped it was going to bring something positive, but I also, was very apprehensive about how we'd survive. But my husband suddenly fell ill, and it turned out to be an appendicitis, but it was pretty severe. And as he was sort of in hospital, not really recovering for a while, I found myself in this, I don't know, this spiral of worry, really, thinking about how we could cope without him, and if everything suddenly became very changed. And shortly after that, I became ill too. And so there was this kind of perfect storm happening where mortality felt like it had visited us. And we were facing a very uncertain future. And amid all of that, our son suddenly stopped coping at school at all, and we had to pull him out for a while. So they're all kind of very unremarkable things in lots of ways, but they threw us into this state where we felt like we were separate to the rest of the world for a while, and we felt like we were in this rolling crisis that was completely unsolvable, and it was hard to accept that we couldn't just scramble our way straight back out of it.
And you talk a lot, rather beautifully. You write with such poetry about very simple things, such as failing to make bagels, for example, and those kind of things. But a lot of it is to do with kind of preparing the house as well as yourself. Tell us about that process of getting ready for a wintering.
So, I mean, throughout the book, I draw a parallel between metaphorical winters and physical winters, actual winters. And I spent a lot of time talking to people who live in the far north and who are visited by much more severe winters than I ever am in Whitstable, where we get snow like once every 4 years, maybe, if we're really lucky, and we get very excited about it. And I wanted to understand how you confronted a winter that would see you snowed in for a season, and that would see your sort of mobility severely restricted, and also a kind of winter that carried real risks if you travelled or, you know, lost your heating for a while. And so, yeah, I spoke to a wonderful Finnish woman called Hannah, who talked about how the Finns begin to, or the Northern Finns begin to prepare for winter in July. They literally start, you know, pickling and preserving food and making sure their freezer is full. And it's not just about having enough food in the house, it's also about having, like, stocking up on pleasure for that time, and making sure that your house is very well prepared and repaired before the snow comes, because you cannot have a hole in your roof by the time the snow arrives, and you will not be able to fix it. So it's a really, really different mindset, and it made me think about how when we hit a personal crisis, we're often doing the opposite. We're often noticing how our life has fallen into a more general state of disrepair. And by the time I was signed off sick from work, I found that my house was just untended to for a very long time, and it was full of kind of corners that needed attention. And yeah, so symbolically, I decided to bake, because I always bake to soothe myself. I decided to bake bagels. And not only did I break my mixer kneading the dough because it was so hard, but also they never rose. And it took me a long time to realize that they didn't rise because the yeast I was trying to use was 10 years out of date. But that's, you know, that's how it goes sometimes, isn't it? That we go through these kind of growth phases, and then we stop coping with them. We don't come to terms with them. And then there's a period of time when we're just about clinging on by our fingernails, and then it lands.
And do you think that writing this book, was it a kind of form of therapy for you? Did you do it because you had this idea after the talk with a friend, or did you feel as you were writing it that it was getting deeper into your own kind of ideas about wintering?
I think that's why I always write books, really. I mean, I wouldn't see them as a form of therapy. I think it's a little different to that, but I do always write a book when I really want to understand something, and when I want to dig deeper into a topic that I'm interested in. So it's a kind of grand excuse, really, to burrow into the research, and to really live that for a while. You know, the joy of writing a book like Wintering is you get to write to the dormouse keeper at the local conservation trust and say, can I come and meet your dormice, please? And, you know, somewhat suspiciously, they will eventually let you. So yeah, I wanted to explore it. I wanted to roam about in it, but I did also feel like I wanted to share the idea. It's been important to me, and I do think it's something we've often lacked in our culture, a way to talk about the bad times as well as the good.
Yes. And have you found that this book has prompted other people to do precisely that, to talk to you, to contact you?
Yeah, yes, yes, full stop. I mean, to a, to a slightly overwhelming degree, actually. I mean, I think these things invite storytelling, and every person has a story to tell on this front, and so when they read the book and relate to it, they want to share their own stories, and often people are talking from a very isolated place where they have not felt able to admit to that that longer wintering phase. The stories I often hear are people who've perhaps lost a partner a year ago and feel like they should really be pulled out of it now, but they're still wintering, and they don't want to tell their friends or family that they're still in this condition, or that they're enduring a long-term illness, or that life has just changed for them so much, and they can't make sense of it. So yeah, I get an awful lot of letters. There's an awful lot of need out there for listening.
And you talked about grief earlier, and I think we live in a society that expects grief to be something done very privately, to not really include on anything else, but that it's something that's short term.
Yes, yeah, a couple of weeks maybe. Then
Yeah.
yeah,
And I
it's
think,
really true. Yeah.
do you think things are changing with that? Because I think there's been quite a lot. We talked to Sasha Bates a few months ago, who's a grief counsellor, and she's written some wonderful books on the subject of grief. And she said that she feels people are starting to talk about it more. Do you feel that
Yeah.
people are addressing mental health issues and issues like grief and bereavement more? Or do you think we're still being pushed back into a Victorian idea of keep it to yourself?
Well, actually, you know what? I think the Victorians were a little better at grief than we are. I mean, I think they externalized it much more. You were, although it was very formal, you were also allowed to express that position you were in, that state of being, in your dress and in your comport, I suppose.
And we didn't show
Um,
any emotion. You're
no,
fine
exactly.
wearing black
Yeah,
to cry.
yeah, that's right. It sort of substituted. I think we've got better in some ways. But I do think it's remarkable how absent that conversation about grief has been in the months after a huge pandemic, when hundreds of thousands of people have been lost. I think we've got a long way to go, and although we are definitely opening up the conversation, it does seem to me that we still don't have, like, it's almost like we've lost our conventions around grief. Like, we don't have a set of norms that we can drop comfortably into. Everyone's making it up themselves, and that is in one way positive, but it's also hugely difficult, I think, because at the one of the darkest points in your life, you're supposed to figure out exactly how to represent this massive and unsteady emotion that you have absolutely no handle on. I like to think we're getting there, but I think we need to see a big return to ritual and ceremony, and to these ways of marking and making manifest our grief, which we still are not really sure about.
So for anybody who is feeling at the moment, as your friend was, which you described at the beginning, feeling that this is a time when everything is going wrong and it will always be wrong, what would be your recommendations for how they should try and embrace this idea of wintering, how they can take care of themselves at this time?
I mean, to be honest, I very much avoid giving recommendations because I feel like it's sort of beyond beyond the scope of what I can offer. But what I've written about is how you can live through this process fully. You can actually be in it. You can allow yourself to feel those emotions when they come, and you can make space for your winter. You can cancel out your diary for a while, and often you have to, right? You're forced into that position, and there's a certain feeling once you're fully there. There's a sense of space that opens up, and there's a sense of very beautiful sadness that can arrive. It's a very domestic experience being in a wintering. You're often stuck at home. You're often bedded into your own little domain, and that's an opportunity to make yourself safe and comfortable in that time. But I also think for me that I always get outside as much as I can. And I guess if I had one bit of advice, that is what I would give always. If you can get outside, even if it's just opening a window, come into contact with those seasons that are shifting around outside of our house. Because what they do is they invite us to understand transformation, and they take us into a place of reflection that lets us really do the work that we're always needing to do in a wintering. And it's a place I trust now, because it's a place that I believe is inevitable, and it is a place where we make the adaptations we need for the next phase, even if that next phase isn't a wanted next phase. Like, it's not necessarily a step up, it might be a step down, but we still can adapt to it, and we can still live a good life within it.
So tell us about your career as a writer, because obviously Wintering has been a phenomenal success. It's been a bestseller, but we all know that writers don't just suddenly
Some do, apparently.
So tell us. Well, I always remember when I read an interview years ago with Mary Wesley. I remember she had her first novel published at the age of 70, and someone called her an overnight sensation. And she said, it's like, after 50 years of writing, I'm suddenly an overnight sensation.
I love that.
I always think about that and think that's really the case, isn't it? So tell us about your career. Did you always want to be a writer? Did you know that was what you wanted to be, or did it kind of come upon you one day?
Yeah, I did all through my childhood, and I loved writing when I was younger, but there did come a point in my teens when I gave it up, because I felt very embarrassed and self-conscious about it, and I felt like it was an impossible dream. I felt like it was naive to want it. So I did give up on writing for a long time, until my mid-20s, when it just kept coming back to haunt me, really. It wouldn't let me step away from it. And I've been working on it ever since. I've had a very slow rise to success. I mean, in lots of ways, I think I'm unusual in that I've genuinely built book on book, whereas I think for a lot of writers, what happens is that you just keep trying until it arrives wholesale. Mine has definitely been like a staircase, which I'm very grateful for, because I think it's made it nice and gradual, so I can get the hang of it as time goes on. But yeah, I published my first book was a collection of short stories with a tiny local press, and I think I probably sold 40 copies. And yeah, I've been working on it since then.
So you write fiction as well as non-fiction memoir. Is that what you planned when you were a child, when you thought about being a writer? Did you just think, I'm going to write stories? I mean, many children don't even know that non-fiction exists. Or did you always
Yeah.
want to write about life?
No, I wanted to be a poet, actually, very specifically. Yeah.
And your
Yeah,
writing is, I mean, you are a poet, aren't you? It's a very, very poetic way of writing.
maybe. I did. I mean, I think actually, in lots of ways, wanting to be a poet was a way of wanting to do life writing. I think I thought that by that was the way that you got to write about real things. But when I started writing again, I did initially start with poetry. And then after a little while, I just began to find it a little limiting, and I dreamed of writing the kind of book that I might see on a bookshop shelf instead. So I kind of shifted on, and I'm not sure if I could write a poem now. It's quite funny. I've trained my brain into a different shape and form. But yeah, no, that was definitely the thing that I dreamed of being first of all, was a poet. And then I think I heard how little poets earn, and realised that it was maybe a bit unrealistic.
So when you first started writing memoir, did you feel that you're giving away so much of yourself? Did it feel uncomfortable? Were you uncertain about actually getting it published? Or did you always feel, I want to get this out there, I want people to know?
it doesn't really bother me, the sharing that happens in memoir. I mean, in fact, like I'm an enthusiastic memoir reader, so that helps. You know that you respect it in other people, and therefore it takes away the kind of concern that it's a strange thing to do. And I have, over the course of my career, seen memoir gaining respect and growing as a medium. I mean, certainly, I think when I was first reading adult books, there was this term misery memoir, and the idea was that memoir was always, it was like either someone writing quite kind of staid recollections about life, or it was someone, showing that they had the worst possible life you can imagine, and it was like a competition to see how dreadful and degraded life could be. But I've loved, for a long time, reading people like Rachel Cusk and Joan Didion.
Two wonderful writers. Well,
two wonderful writers, and I guess therefore memoir has always seemed like a very, very legitimate medium for me. That said, there is always the terror that comes, the day before a book comes out, that suddenly a lot of people, if you're lucky, will know a lot about you. But from experience, I know that most people are just incredibly kind.
Mm-hmm. That's a lovely thought. So have you found that other people who appear in your memoirs, do they have an issue with it? Are they excited? Are they a bit disconcerted when they see how you describe them in prose?
I am incredibly careful about the way I handle other people in my memoirs, and I know this is different to other memoirists, but I always have to be the butt of any joke, or it's my flaws and misconceptions that I'm always seeking to reveal. Like I'm never ever writing memoir to somehow punish other people or to expose them or reveal them, which I know that some memoirists definitely do. And that principle makes, I think, me a lot more of a safe bet. I always ask people really carefully if I'm going to write about them. I always show them the text, and let them, have their say on it. But the vast majority of the time, I mean, I think always actually, people are kind of delighted to be written about. If you're being kind, obviously.
Yeah.
And that's because, most lives are so totally anonymous. I mean, for example, I had a big worry when I wrote the bit about Hannah in Wintering, where she talked about her father committing suicide. Like, it was a little bit that she'd mentioned right at the end of our conversation, and I put it in because I thought it gave the piece real impact, and really framed the conversation we'd had and showed why it mattered. But as I wrote it, I thought, did she mean that as part of the interview, or was that really an aside? And I worried about it for ages because I didn't want her to cut it. But eventually I showed it to her, and she said, I'm so pleased to have that there. This is a thing that happened to me when I was a teenager, and it's been so important in my life and so invisible. And I love that it's in a book. And that made me really happy. Like it made me feel that I can honor other people's experiences if I'm careful with them and ethical with them. And that's what I always try to do.
So would you like to give us a reading from Wintering?
Yeah, I'm going to read you a bit. I was just leafing through this from the beginning of November, and obviously it was a very different meteorological year that year, because it's reminding me of the weather today. The chapter's called Metamorphosis. There is a change in the air. Every morning when I open the back door, it billows into the kitchen, crisp, cold, and fresh as mint. It makes white clouds of my breath. Winter has decorated ordinary life. Some days everything sparkles, glamorizing the lids of bins and the tarmac patchwork of the pavements. Frost etches mysterious patterns on the roof of our car, and the puddles that collect in the gutter are crisp with ice. My cats have taken on their winter coats. Lulu, our black and white moggy, is marmite brown in the summer, but goes boot polish black when the cold comes. Heidi, our tortoise shell, loses her warm weather blondes and becomes plush and velvety, her gingery tones deepening to red. They are suddenly present in the house, having avoided us all summer when the warm nights invite adventure. Just like us, they're craving comfy cushions and the occasional fire. I'm changing too. Now that they're wrapped in socks all day, my feet turn from their summer brown to winter white, and my sunshine freckles fade away. My shins and knees are drying out. My face drinks in moisturiser every morning. Deprived of sun, my hair darkens and the skin frays around my nails. Mine is a drab winter coat, usually lifted by bright red cheeks, the legacy of coastal winds. But then winter is no time to put on a display. I love the separation it brings, the way that people are scarce even during the daylight hours, when you can drink in the dilute light of the low sun, your shadow stretching long at your feet.
That's really beautiful. And I hope that people listening will have an idea of how poetic the language is. And do remember, of course, that if you want to ask Katherine any questions, please put them in the chat. You can either send them directly to me or send them in the open chat. So we're going to talk about another of your books now, The Electricity of Every Living Thing, A Woman's Walk in the Wild to Find Her Way Home. Please, could you tell us about that one?
Yeah, so that was the book. I'm just looking, I have my copy here and I don't know where I put it. That was the book I wrote before I wrote Wintering. It was a memoir about, it was supposed to be a memoir about a long walk I took around the Southwest Coast Path while I thought about how to cope with motherhood. But as I walked my way into an autism diagnosis, which I'd needed for a very, very long time and didn't know was even possible. And so it became a sort of diary and a memoir of learning you're autistic later in life and having to look back over the course of a long adult life and to reconfigure yourself and to learn to see yourself anew.
So when you were doing this walk, what did you discover, do you think, about yourself? What was the experience that you felt, I must write about this? Was it one particular thing, or was it just in general, you know, I want to write I want to write a book, so I'm going to do it? Or was it something that you felt was like a kind of mission?
It's hard to say in a way. I mean, I think it was all about the kind of gradual process, really, and the way that walking kind of changed my mind, like in both senses that you can understand that sentence. So it created this this state of mind, because I was spending, you know, many hours walking alone, and it sort of opened up this space that let me reflect on a lot of things that I'd been trying not to think about for a long time, or that I hadn't understood. And it kind of brought me to a place of receptiveness, I think. I was ready for a change. I was wondering what was happening. And a few months into the walk, because I was walking once a month. I was going, because Devon is very far from us, so we were driving down once a month so I could do 25 miles. And I was driving one day in between walks, and I heard a woman on the radio talk about being autistic, and it was the first time I'd ever heard someone describe that from the inside, like rather than describe it from what it looks like from the outside to somebody who isn't autistic. And I felt this immediate recognition, this absolute certainty that she was the same as me. And without the walk, I don't know if I'd have been able to make that leap. So it was, yeah, it was a very significant period in my life.
So discovering that you were autistic, what did that mean for your family, for your career, perhaps? Was it helpful? Was it a bewildering time? Was it something that everything makes sense? Or did you think nothing makes sense?
Okay, so it's all of those things at once. Like in lots of ways, it's an enormous relief to understand why you feel so profoundly different from other people and have done all of your life. You know, the psychiatrist that diagnosed me said, it's so weird, like every other diagnosis I give to people, they're upset about, but autism, people are always really pleased to hear it, because it's such a it's this moment of relief, having known there's something. And it took a long while for it to settle in my mind. It shakes everything up, and it brings you back into contact with some of the things that you were struggling with, but which you'd kind of suppressed so that you could get on with life. And of course, you have to deal with other people's views on it. Like, people aren't necessarily very well informed about it, but have an opinion nevertheless, as with so many things in life.
Good.
I'm sure you've never come across that. And so, there's a kind of period, I think, for the first year where it acts a little like grief, in that you're having to retell your story over and over again, and you're having to remind yourself of your story every time you wake up in the morning. And so you come to terms with the idea over and over, and you go through the kind of doubts, and you go through the not wanting it to be the case, and, and all that kind of thing. But from where I am now, it's something I'm incredibly grateful to know about myself, and it's certainly not something I would change about myself either. And it's opened up the possibility of coping better, and of adapting, rather than just carrying on trying to pretend that my responses were the same as everybody else's. So yeah, it's a personal revolution, definitely, when it happens.
So to anybody listening to this, what would you like to say to them? What would your advice be if they have a friend or family member who's autistic and they don't really know what that means, or how to deal with it? What would you say?
Or maybe they are themselves. This is the thing, right? That it's been vastly under identified across across all of time, because we've only really noticed the people whose needs are the most extreme. And so there will be probably some people in your book club who, particularly if they're drawn actually to writing and books and things like that, who may have been living a whole life feeling like their emotional responses are different, feeling like they're more sensitive than other people, that things like sound can be very unbearable, that tastes can be too strong, that they have struggled to get along with big groups of people. Like, often we don't like parties. We often wonder why our friendship patterns are different. And the kind of classical, one of the things that's on every autism diagnosis questionnaire is, do you always have to cut the labels out of the back of your t-shirt? it's the thing that we all have in common. Like, we can't bear it, because being autistic, as opposed to looking autistic from the outside, is an experience of intense sensory sensitivity, and some neurological differences that mean that we are often like very justice oriented. We're not interested in small talk. We're not interested in the insignificant. The phrase "go deep or go home" could have been made for us. We want to make strong connections and express our interests and fascinations all the time. And so, if there might be some people here listening, and there normally are, who think, oh God, that's me. But if there's someone in your life who identifies that way, then the best thing you can do is make space for them to be who they are, and let them ask for what they need, rather than trying to fit them into a box that looks like everyone else. So a really good example of that is at Christmas, we have a quiet room in our house that any of our more neurodivergent tribe, because there's a few of us, can go off and take a break for a while. And that makes a huge difference to those of us who get a little overwhelmed sometimes. So it's all about, finding ways to integrate that, rather than to try and push it away.
Good. Now, you write a lot about motherhood, I think, in all your books. I'm going to talk to you about another book that I believe you were the editor of, Best Most Awful Job, 20
Yes.
writers honestly about motherhood. And I'd like to say is I'm not a mother, and I've been fascinated by my friends who are, how they talk very openly to me, things they feel they can't say.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah,
and so I find that fascinating. Discover writing this book, or editing this book, what did you feel that you wanted people to know about?
Well, when the book was commissioned, we put together like a letter that we would send out to all of our writers, and what we asked them was to tell us what they would tell someone if they felt they were trusted to love their children anyway. And I think maybe that's why you kind of get that kind of messaging as well. There's been this real terror of expressing the darker parts of motherhood and the difficult parts, because nobody wants to be seen to be an inadequate mother or not to adore their children. And the truth is, like, it's often both. We can be besotted with our children and also find the experience of motherhood incredibly difficult. And so we wanted to invite some people who maybe haven't been asked about motherhood before. So there's a really interesting essay in there from Simon Mia, who is a Muslim mother, talking about maternal rage and that experience of how angry you get sometimes about your situation. And that, I think that's been probably one of the big hits of the book, actually, because we don't ask Muslim women about that kind of thing. We maybe let white women say it, but probably quite often not. But actually, the pressure to be a model minority is really huge. There's a great essay from Leah Hazard talking about being a mother and being a midwife, and what you know if you know both of those things. And there's also a brilliant essay from Peggy Riley talking about being someone who never quite managed to become a mother. She endured several miscarriages, and having that kind of maternal desire still inside you, and not having been able to actually fully live it, being like a mother who isn't a mother. And so it was just about bringing in all these perspectives that are really quite hidden from the mainstream. And I think they're all wonderful. It's the great thing about being the editor rather than the writer, is you can say, I think that's a wonderful book.
Your idea? Did the publisher come to you, or was it something that you'd thought about doing before?
A little of each. No, I hadn't really thought of it. The publisher came to me. I knew the publisher, so she was. The nice thing about when the publisher knows you is they can say, "We've got a gap in our schedule. Do you think you can fill it?" Otherwise, that would be really offensive. But she said, "Oh, we'd really love to publish something about motherhood that moves the conversation on." And I found that idea really exciting. So from there, we spent a little while thinking about exactly how to frame that so that it felt directional and fresh and different to anything else. And we wanted to make absolutely sure that it wasn't a kind of sentimentalized book, that it wasn't kind of marketed as like, to mum with love or anything like that. Because we've had plenty of that. And, so yeah, we kind of worked the concept for a long time before going out to our writers. And the hardest thing to come to was the title, honestly. It was that was a really tricky one. But this idea of the best most awful job just kept coming back. That it was that it was both at once, both at the same time. It was an and rather than an or. So that's that name kept sticking, coming up and not going away.
And when you were reading them, did you identify with lots of them? Did you think, gosh, this is wonderful, people are going to really get something out of this? Were there any that you just thought, oh wow, no, I would never have thought of that before?
A little of both, really. And I think in most of them there were things that I deeply understood and things that I didn't. The one that made me laugh the most was Jodie Bartle's High on Oxytocin and Tea, where she talks about having, I think she's got 7 children now, all boys, and how much she loves giving birth. Like she's addicted to that baby phase, which I do not relate to in any way whatsoever, having only had one child and swearing off it ever again. But at the same time, yes, you do kind of relate to it, because it is about this other state that you can enter, and I get it. I don't have the same feeling, but I get it, definitely.
So we've got a question that's come into the chat that says, I was convinced my partner is autistic, but now I'm wondering if it's me.
Or both of you. Autistic people are often very attracted to each other, and across friendship groups as well. So it could be both of you.
And so would you recommend that they talk to their doctor to get a diagnosis, or?
Depends if you want to. I mean, it's completely valid to explore it yourself and to try and understand it for yourself and to even diagnose yourself. I mean, unless you want to be want some kind of benefit or to be signed off of work, actually it can make it more complex going through the NHS because diagnosis takes a long time and it can be very kind of painful, and it's not necessarily designed to be affirmative of who you are. It's a very sort of medicalized model. I would read around it. I mean, I don't just mean my book. I mean, please read my book. but but I've actually I can give you a link. I've got a page on my website that is a resource for people who are interested in learning about autism for the first time, and it's got lots of links to different articles and books and things like that that you can read. So I'll pass that on to you a little later if you'd like.
Thank you.
And have a read around, see what you think.
And I'm going to put something into the chat, which is the link to Catherine's newsletter. You can sign up for her newsletter.
Oh, yes.
Is interested in that. So tell us about your writing day. I mean, do you write every single day? Do you vary every single day? Do you just not have a routine?
I don't really have a routine. I don't enjoy having a routine, to be honest. Like I'm very much a person who likes to do what they feel on the day. I don't get the chance to write all the time. One of the sort of the dubious honors of having an international best-selling book is that you spend an awful lot of time doing things that aren't writing. And so actually, every now and again I get to knuckle down and do some writing, and then I will block out time in my week but even then I rarely write every day because I find that it empties my brain too much. Like 4 days a week is always plenty for me. And then I'm spent, and I really need to kind of replenish again for a few days. But if I had any routine, it would be variety. So I write in all kinds of different places over the house, and sometimes go to a co-working space down the road where I love to write. I walk a lot, and I count that as writing because that's where I do my thinking. And I go for great periods of time without writing a single thing.
That's so refreshing. Yeah, it makes me feel a lot better because I've had very little writing time in the last few weeks. So so many writers come on, they say, oh yes, I have to do 8 hours a day and I have to be here, and I am the same as you. I write in lots of different places and at different times. So that's great. So if anybody here is listening to lots of our interviews, which are wonderful, and some people are, they have their every single day they have to write X number of words. But if you are one of those people who's listening, you've got absolute validation here that you don't have to do it every single day and you can still be a writer. So you've got a new book that's coming out very soon, haven't you? Do you want to tell us a little bit about that and when it's coming out?
Yes, Enchantment. I can show you a copy of it. It looks really pretty. Enchantment is coming out in March, first week of March. So it's not very far away now. It's a book that follows on from Wintering, really. It's a book about how, in this extended dark time where we seem to be caught up in so many different political movements, in the pandemic, in the huge changes that are taking place, how the most important thing we can do is reaffirm our sense of magic and wonder to make a connection with the world around us that can sustain us psychologically while everything else is kind of raging on around us. So yeah, very much a book for our times, I hope.
Absolutely. So how did you find personally with the pandemic? Did it encourage you to write this, or did you have to wait until you were at a certain point when you could actually feel you had that distance? I personally found it very hard to write at the beginning of the pandemic. That panic, that sense of fear, I found very non-conducive to writing. Other people saw it as wonderful writing time. What was it like for you?
A little of both. I think at the beginning I wrote about it, and I was doing a daily dispatch for my local radio station, and that kept me going for a while. But of course I had a child at home, my husband was working from home, the house felt very full, and after a while I felt like I ground to a halt, really. And as the time wore on, I found it impossible to read as well as write. And part of the story of Enchantment is me getting my sort of mojo back for reading, because that was a huge loss to me. And I felt like I lost my attention span altogether and my ability to concentrate, because I was forever looking over my shoulder. The world felt dangerous, and there always seemed to be something more urgent for me to pay attention to, rather than, reading a novel. So yeah, I think both. And there was a long hangover. It was, it was very hard to write Enchantment because I was so brain foggy, honestly.
Yeah, it's fascinating how many people I know who say the same thing about not being able to read. I think that happens in times of great grief as well, that not being able to read as much as normal, or losing that desire. And it's strange because you'd think it would be the one time we'd want to lose ourselves, particularly in something like fiction where you can go into a totally created world. But so many people found that tough. And I know people have shared on Goldster before, that they had a really difficult time with it. I'm going to come back to Katherine in just a minute. I'm going to tell everybody what is coming up in the next couple of weeks. So tomorrow I'm back with you again. You've had Humphrey for a couple of weeks, but I'm back talking to Caroline Crampton, who is the author of several non-fiction books, including the very beautiful The Way to the Sea. And she's working on a book called A Body Made of Glass. Now, you may know her name because she also makes a podcast about detective fiction called She Done It. So I'm really looking forward to chatting with her about all of those things. And then on the 15th of December, we're returning to Agatha Christie. Some of you may remember that during our Agatha Christie month, we were supposed to be talking to the author Mark Aldridge. And he's written several books. He's a professor as well, including a biography of Agatha Christie's Poirot. And because of the death of the Queen, of course, we changed our programme then. So I'm thrilled that Mark is going to come back and talk about it. His other books include The Birth of British Television and T is for Television, where he talks a lot and teaches a lot about TV writers. And he's also written books about Agatha Christie being adapted. Then on the 16th, next Friday, a week tomorrow, Humphrey is back talking to Alex Shaw, who's an internationally best-selling author of the Aidan Snow and Jack Tate thrillers. And as you know, Humphrey himself also writes thrillers. That's going to be a really wonderful chat. And then on the 22nd of December, Humphrey is back with you again, talking to Samur Gray, who's becoming a really well-known face on Goldster, I think. And I am back on the 23rd of December. I'm talking to the author Jeremy Seal. Now, some of you may remember quite a while ago now, I talked to him about his travel writing, but this is actually, in a very seasonal way, talking about his biography of St. Nicholas, who we might know better as Father Christmas. So, and by the way, you may be wondering why my background is very un-Christmassy, but I'm very excited that I will finally get the chance to decorate for Christmas very soon. We've had a comment here. Katherine has put in on her link to her website, her autism resource page, sorry. And I've got someone who says there's a lot of autism and Asperger's in my family. I believe we're all on the spectrum to some degree. And I think that means everybody in the world, not just everybody in their family. So, Katherine, what would you tell people who are watching this today and they're perhaps at the early stage of their writing career, or they're perhaps retiring and think that they might want to start writing? Perhaps they've, as you said, wanted to write for a long time before they get round to it. What would be your tips for people?
Do you know what? Writing is knitted through my whole life, and I always find it very hard to think of specific tips, because it feels to me like you have to almost live writing. You have to let it sort of reproduce itself like a virus through everything you do. And for me, my best ideas and my most passionate sort of focuses of subject come from obsessions that I let grow, and that I don't separate off into a couple of hours a day at my desk, that instead I kind of let be everything to me, and I dive deep into them. I mean, part of that is the very autistic experience of how you want to focus deeply on things you're passionate about. But I think that's always my advice, is to realize that you're writing all the time, that you're writing when you're in the shower, and that you're writing when you're falling asleep at night, and you're writing when you're taking a walk, and you're writing when you do the shopping. Like the actual typing of words onto a page is the tiny tip of the iceberg, and the work that you do is constant. And I think that lets you make a lot more space than you might think you have for writing, because you can always be thinking.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Thank you so much. It has been a real joy to talk to you today, Katherine. I really appreciate it. For those of you who just want to have a quick look, you can see how dogged it is. I really love this book. This is the book that mostly we're talking about now, Wintering, The Power of Rest and Retreat in Difficult Times. I can thoroughly recommend it. I'm very much looking forward to Enchantment coming out.
It's on its way.
Yeah, the 5th of March, according to bookshop.org.
Is that what it is? It's 5th. It's different in the US and the UK, so I'm completely confused now.
Well, you can pre-order that, everybody. The full title is Enchantment, Reawakening Wonder in an Exhausted Age. Oh my goodness, I think we can all absolutely identify with that so much. Thank you for the nice comments that are coming in, everybody. Katherine, it's been a real joy. And somebody here has said Wintering was so comforting. Yeah, I agree.
That's good to hear.
A very, very comforting book. Take care, everybody. I will look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Katherine, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We will turn off our videos now, and then Joe, our concierge, will end the meeting, but I'll see you tomorrow. And please do check the Goldster website to see everything else that's coming up. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.